Welcome everyone. We're just gonna give a few minutes to ensure everybody can access the links and join the event. I think we'll give one more minute to let people join, and then we can start with the welcome introductions. Alrighty, I think we're good to go. So hi everyone, my name is Raphaël Gave. I am the Director of Students and Academic Affairs at the IPAC-NCR. I'd like to welcome you to today's event on social welfare reform. Bienvenue à tous à cet événement qui portera en majorité au sujet du revenu minimum garanti. First off, I'd like for us to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we each gather today, albeit virtually. Whether you're from BC or across Turtle Island in PEI, for example, or elsewhere in the Atlantic. For myself and my IPAC colleagues, we are in the National Capital Region, so we gather on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Next up, I'd like to just quickly go over some housekeeping items. First of all, so the event will be recorded. Please do remain muted at all times. There will be a Q&A period towards the end of the event after the panel discussion. So feel free to write your questions in the chat box or on Twitter. We will be monitoring those. N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en français. On va traduire de manière simultanée en anglais pour les panélistes qui répondront bien évidemment en anglais. So you can tweet and engage with us. I think you can see the poster. It's IPAC_NCR, which is the handle, and the hashtag is a bilingual hashtag, so IPAC 2021 IAPC. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our very own IPAC-NCR moderator, Ursula Goebel, which is our vice chair at IPAC-NCR on our board. During her day job, Ursula is our vice president of stakeholder and engagement at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Ursula, over to you.
Thank you, Raphaël. Bonjour, bonsoir à tous et toutes. I'm absolutely delighted and to be honored, in fact, to have the opportunity to moderate this, what will be a fascinating discussion. And we are very honored as well to welcome three very special guests as part of our panel discussion, not only amongst themselves, but very much with the audience. And I will, while we have seen the poster, I do feel very importantly that it's important to acknowledge their presence again. And again, we have Sheila Riguer, the founding member of Basic Income Canada Network and the former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. Dr. David Green, a professor at the UBC Vancouver School of Economics and chair of the British Columbia Basic Income Panel. And Paul Ledwell, clerk of Executive Council and Secretary to Cabinet, the government of PEI. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us at this very special IPAC-NCR event this evening here in Ottawa. And of course, our panelists join us from coast to coast, from BC, within Ontario, and then over to PEI. So we have lots of questions and to address, but we thought we would begin with a particular point that we would address to each of the panelists first to get us started, and then open it up to a discussion among all the panelists for a number of the key questions that have certainly have been very relevant to the discussion. And then we will look quickly to the questions coming forward in the chat as well. So keep those coming, and Raphael, I'll turn it over to you at that point to turn it over. So let's begin. So federally, several initiatives from Canada feature elements of partial basic income for specific groups, which contribute to raising Canadians below the poverty line. This includes the Canada Child Benefit for families and children, and the Old Age Security and Guaranteed Income Supplement for Canadian seniors. So I'm going to invite Sheila first from BICN. The BICN, which presented a report outlining options for moving towards the basic income. So can you talk to us a bit about your work and explain what you see the key benefits of basic income are?
Thank you very much, Ursula. Bonsoir, tout le monde. And thank you to the organizers for this event. I think it's really important. I'm going to try to cover quite a bit in just a few minutes. So first, we were asked to talk about COVID. And for me, I think what COVID has really spotlighted is that our income security systems are not meeting the need. People talk about there being cracks in the system. I would call them chasms. They're not just cracks. And it's important to note that CERB and other emergency benefits, that cash instinct from our perspective was the right one, but it had flaws. So we've still got some more work to do. I think the good news is that we have solutions, as you started to talk about, Ursula, and as a colleague of mine from Quebec calls, the solutions are right under our noses. And those are things like the national unconditional cash transfers that we provide to people 65 and over, and to parents. And it's important for me to stress constantly, this is called a child benefit program. The kids don't get the money. The money goes to adults, the adults that we often worry about and how they spend their money. So, and it only goes to them for a while. You know, once your kids reach 18, that family is not getting anything anymore. So that leaves young adults in a real dilemma. So we've got this experience of those kinds of programs that's well established. We've also got a whole lot of other little programs that show that we're moving towards unconditional cash transfers, like the GST credit. There are programs in some provinces called Rent Assist. It has nothing to do with rent. You get your money, you can spend it however you want. I think in BC, there's something called a climate rebate or climate credit or something. It's the same thing. It's an unconditional cash transfer. So we've got these little things out there. So if you're fortunate enough to fit into one of those groups, you have pretty good income security. If you're not, the last resort, and too often the quickest resort for many people, is social assistance. So it in fact is the opposite. So Canada's running two oppositional programs built on different ideas. One says we trust people with cash and they know what to do with it. And the other says, I don't know what social assistance says. We don't trust people. We can't give you very much because you might squander it somehow, or we need to make sure you're punished so that the labor force looks better even though you don't make very much money. The other two panelists you're going to hear from are people who come from largely a provincial perspective. So I just wanted to stress that we have always argued for a national program. And we do need that national program, I think, in order to be able to afford it and do a good job. Just very quickly, I want to talk about what the evidence shows. So there have been, in addition to Canada's programs, there have been pilots run here and around the world. They all have a different context and they're all run differently, but there's a common pattern of benefits that comes out. So you see everywhere, you see empowerment of people who are the most disenfranchised, you see better physical and mental health, you see better community cooperation, you see more options for paid employment, including entrepreneurship. You see reduced violence. That pattern is fairly consistent and it's preventative. You see the opposite pattern. Again, this is evidence we've got. The opposite pattern from social assistance is deep poverty that makes deterioration almost inevitable. So that's where we are now. We've got experience running two different kinds of programs. We also have a lot of race, class, and gender biases that run through these programs and a number of others. Kind of complicated to explain it quickly, but if you can resolve that poverty problem and that inequality problem with a basic income, you also start to resolve an awful lot of other programs that link to racism, gender discrimination, the challenges that people with disabilities face, things like that. And this is where some people start building up a mythology around basic income that we expect it's going to do everything. Well, it's not. I mean, that's clearly nonsense. So no mythology. I like to quote Andrew Coyne on this one. So he says, basic income doesn't have to cure the common cold. It's just got to be better than what we've got. And I think Canada should have every degree of confidence that we've got what it takes to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and definitely lots to think about in terms of what you've positioned as very much a national program, even though recognizing the various programs, in your words, that can seem to be oppositional in nature. So you're right, we do have our other panelists who are going to bring provincial perspectives through their work. So I will turn it to Dr. Green. So in the context of provincially, we have Manitoba, who had a minimum guaranteed income in 1970, recently in Quebec, led in 2016 some work that recommended the province establish a guaranteed minimum income. Ontario led a pilot in 2017 for guaranteed income before it had to be canceled in 2018. And PEI and BC have their own story to tell, and we'll hear from Paul later in terms of PEI. So Dr. Green, Professor Green recently chaired a panel that examined whether a basic income would be the best way to reduce poverty in BC. It found that there are better ways than a basic income guarantee to use government policy to improve people's lives. And so, Dr. Green, can you talk about that report, that BC report, and share some of the key conclusions and recommendations, and perhaps how these are relevant in the context of post-pandemic recovery?
Sure. Like Sheila, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, especially with this panel. I've long followed Sheila's work, and I've always been impressed with what she does. Paul, I've only just met, but anyway, it's an honor to be on this panel with these people. Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about the panel. The panel, although it's true we're struck in a BC context, we view most of the conclusions as relevant at the national level. And also, as everybody here knows, the federal provincial interactions on most of this file are incredibly important. And so once one gets into talking about a basic income, you pretty quickly have to be talking in both realms. It's just the truth of the situation we all live in. I would say, what do I want to express? Let me just sort of give you the broad outline of what we concluded in terms of a basic income. A lot of the report is about, like there's 65 recommendations that have to do with other parts, some of which are sort of targeted basic incomes for particular groups. But let me give you the sort of overall conclusions that we reached in terms of basic income in general. And part of that is that I think we came to a different reading on some of the evidence that Sheila quoted than the way Sheila expressed it. I think one of the things that's really appealing about a basic income, I think this comes back partly to some of what Sheila was talking about and some of the things she's written about in other contexts, is that one of the big concerns with the system we have now is concerns about dignity for individuals, is about how do we help the people that we all are seeking to help, and not just to help, but to engage and bring in as part of the process. How do we do that in a way that's dignified? And one of the promises of the basic income, in some sense, comes from its simplicity. The idea that what we're going to do is we're going to get money to people through the tax system, and a lot of the proposed versions of basic income are really implemented through the Canadian tax system with details on how that would be done. We're gonna do that, and that means that then you don't have people checking intrusively into lives. You take a bunch of conditionality out. You deliver the money easily. It's sort of like, the sword going through the Gordian knot. It seems so straightforward. And a lot of what we came to conclude, because a lot of what we did was ask the question, if we were going to have a basic income in BC, what would it look like? How would we really integrate it with provincial programs? And we quickly came to the conclusion that a basic income, if fully implemented, would also be a complex system. And you can see that, for example, if you think about people living with a disability, quite rightly, I think virtually all basic income proponents in Canada will say that we need to keep supports and services in place for this community. But of course, when you do that, you're keeping all the conditionality of one of the most intrusive parts of our system as it stands now. And therefore, in that part of the system, our argument was actually a targeted basic income for people living with a disability, but a reform of the system with a lot of emphasis on providing supports for people to work, for example, because a lot of what we heard when we talked with the people living with disabilities community was a real desire for the kinds of supports that help us work. So that's one element. If you go into other elements, so if you go into Sheila's quite excellent report on basic income and look at the options, there, as in other reports, a lot of the funding comes from getting rid of the basic personal exemption. If you do that and you add in the tax back rates from the system itself, from the basic income itself, you get to a marginal effective tax rate, so that the amount that your income would be reduced, your basic income would be reduced as you earned money, that are in the 65 to 70% range. If you add in, if you go to the Demogrant version where you're sending a check to everyone, you're now at 90% range. So you're basically in a world where the quote unquote welfare wall is either where we are now in the social assistance system or sort of in the vicinity of where it would be with reforms. Again, also you think about issues like 14% of Canadians don't actually file taxes in a year. So we're going to need to find those people to get the money to them. And if we want to deliver it on a timely basis, we know that the tax system as it exists now is not good at that. If you lose your job now, it'll be next year at this time before you can tell the government on your taxes. All of that is recognized. Like Sheila and everybody else who is pushing for a basic income knows all of that stuff. My point is not that this is different for a basic income, it's that it's the same. It's that you are, again, dealing with a complex system where you have to deal with the complexities. And then the issue becomes, is a basic income a better way to handle the questions we need to handle relative to other complex systems? And that's where, as we sort of went down the line, reducing poverty, looking at problems in the labor market, housing issues, as we go down the line and we looked at each one of these one by one, our sort of the research underlying this, and there's 43 research papers that we commissioned for this, just didn't seem to suggest that the basic income was the most effective way to do that. And that's because it's not particularly targeted, right? You're trying to hit a lot of targets with one tool in some sense. And finally, this is the last thing I'll say. I know I'm running out of time. I think there's also a big question, and I'm very interested in this discussion with everyone. I think there's also a big question of philosophy here, right? Which is, in some sense, you go for a system like this or reforming the systems we have, we're talking about things that form the basis of our society and how we see our society, and the question of what we owe each other. Our concern in the end was that a basic income, where what we do is we give people money and then we send them to the market to solve the problems that follow, or the problems they need to deal with, is one that really emphasizes autonomy at the expense of, say, community. And that's why we believe that something more like a basic services model is probably better. I can see I'm running over, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I'm usually so good at that. All of your points are so important, because it is, it's the issues of complexity, but also, and I'll use the term, intersectionality, recognizing the relationships of basic income and its relativity to other systems is really, really important. So thank you for that. And so over to Paul, to my earlier point. So I mentioned that the PEI government has been examining basic income and showing interest in BI. And there's also discussion and some thoughts of a secure income pilot, narrower in scope than BI, but to help with individuals with severe barriers to entering the workforce. So over to you, Paul, to describe that a little bit further for our audience.
Great, and thank you, Ursula, and thank you to IPAC-NCR for organizing this. It's great for David and I to be able to join from opposite coasts and to really have a national discussion in the National Capital Region, and really appreciate it. Appreciate that I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq, so Kwe to everyone. And I should say, dès que je parlerai plutôt en anglais, je suis prêt à prendre des questions en français également. So in PEI, I want to pick up on one point that I think both Sheila and David made. David underlined it in particular, and that's the question of dignity. We live in a small place, as you would know. We are a close community, and we can see very clearly around us, and this is from government perspective, from the perspective of community actors and leaders. We can see the faces of poverty, of struggle, of challenge right in our midst. And so the ethic of trying to address and encourage and improve the plight of people in this province is very much at the heart of everything that we're interested in. So that issue of dignity, of providing a path, of providing supports that are essential, I think is really quite important. Also would like to echo the points about universality and how really significant it has been. And we see this in our case very, very clearly by data and by experience, how things like the Canada Child Benefit and OAS-GIS have made a considerable improved difference for people who are recipient of those. That, of course, has left some behind and has raised the issue of how do we encourage supports for those individuals, families who are not beneficiary of those kinds of universal supports. It doesn't end, though, just in terms of income supports. It also extends to programmatic and service supports that are really quite essential. And one of the issues that we are finding very much in our jurisdiction is pressures around housing, for example. The cost of housing, the availability of adequate housing is a major challenge. And it might surprise everyone that, Prince Edward Island has sadly led the country in the last few years in having the lowest accommodation rates, the highest or the lowest vacancy rates for rental accommodation. So it's really put great pressure on available and affordable accommodations, and that's been an issue that we have addressed. We've also addressed, and here I think it's really important in terms of our current context, generally over the last couple of years, but particularly through the period of COVID, supports for diverse populations, specifically for women and other and for minority groups. We've made significant investments in childcare. We have what is termed, and we have debates with our colleagues in Quebec, but has been ranked the top childcare system in the country. And we plan to invest and to go further in that. It has led to the highest participation rate of women in the workforce in PEI east of Manitoba. So it's really had a direct impact, but we need to know more, and we're aware of that. So the last issue that I will raise, and I should say through all of this, we are in very much in searching mode. We have a government here that is a progressive conservative government. Our premier is very quick to say it's a progressive conservative government that is very much in support of looking for solutions and ways to support encouraging people and bringing people out of poverty. It's not just about poverty elimination, it's about reduction, it's about poverty eradication. We have had an all-party committee that has supported the concept and has encouraged us to go further in terms of basic income, whether that be a pilot here, and we've started 2 pilots in recent months, or to do it universally or together with the federal government, and understanding the challenges with that. But I do want to kind of raise and my first comments on the issue of complexity, and Ursula, you picked up on that. And I think one of the issues that we grapple with is what are we trying to resolve here? And there seems to be in this debate often a conflation of 3 different issues. The first is poverty reduction or poverty elimination. The second is around income inequality, which is real and of course is growing by data. And the last is income insecurity. And what we were faced with, and again, we've seen this in the last 12 months through COVID, of people who are dropping out or being forced out of the workforce and or in the gig economy, and there's some real challenge on the security that they have. So in each of those cases, we are looking for real solutions. We're trying to get a better understanding and handle on those who are living within the gaps and finding solutions to raise them and out of the gaps, but to ensure that they don't fall through the gaps again. And so within that consideration, we certainly are studying and trying to better understand and better develop and even better apply the concepts of basic income in a BI context.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to David and Sheila as well for their opening remarks. And it set us really well, I think, for a number of now perhaps a little bit more granular interconnected issues that have been touched upon. And we do see the comments and the questions coming up in the chat, which are fantastic. So we're going to spend about half an hour with a few other questions that I'm going to open up to everyone, to all of our panelists to address. And maybe beginning with the first one, a little bit of a summary, in fact, of some of what was already addressed in the context, if we could use that term of mainstreaming basic income. Paul, you just shared some of the perspectives on different approaches that are being addressed or being discussed to address poverty eradication, if I can use that term. Is there anything else that David or Sheila that you'd like to add to that in terms of the different approaches that you understand are being discussed to address poverty at this time?
Sure. Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. The one thing that concerns me when we start talking about complexity and basic income, I mean, I agree with David. I mean, this is a lot of work. It does take complexity to design a program that in the end should be simpler for people. But I think none of these things is an either or situation. I mean, there are always going to be people who are going to need additional help with other things. So when people talk about poverty as being complex, it bothers me. I don't think poverty is complex at all. I think life is. The poverty problem, you know, if you define it as income poverty, you can fix that. The rest of the things we talk about are all things that travel with poverty, but they don't have to be part of it, and they're life things. So lack of education is a life thing. You know, facing a health concern is a life thing. It's so until you disentangle income poverty from these other things, it makes it much harder to address those other things. So to the extent that you can deal with income, then you find out what the other problems look like. Really quick example, there was a study done a number of years ago by the federal government. No, it was McMaster University, I think. Anyway, they were looking at solutions for depressed single mothers. They did the study, they found out the single mothers are not clinically depressed at all. They live depressing lives. You fix the life situation and they're mentally fine. So rather than investing in mental health services, you give them some money and some time and some recreation for their kids, and other things resolve. So, you know, we can do a lot to simplify and not to pretend that that we can't do both, that we meet the income needs and the other needs. I think we can do both better.
Okay, David, thoughts on different approaches?
A little bit. I mean, I you know, in some ways, I'm not sure Sheila and I are that far apart on a lot of this, does that tell you the honest truth? But I didn't mean to imply that poverty was complex. I agree with Sheila's characterization, at least of income poverty. I do actually think that a lot of these other issues are entangled with the poverty, the income part of the problem, in ways that make it not easily separable, in my mind. And so let me give you an example on the other hand, and this is an example that Sheila brought up earlier, which is youth aging out of foster care, which is a big issue in BC. I'm sure it's a big issue across the country. Now here, I think it becomes almost immediately obvious when you think about this, that you need to think about all of this together, and that the income part does not separate the other part. You're not, you know, giving a 19-year-old a check who has lived with trauma by definition up to this point in their lives is, and I know she'll agree, this is not the final solution in any sense, but that means that you need to think about it all integrated. How are you going to get the money to them? And so in our recommendations, we basically suggest an approach that is very community-based. In BC, about 2/3 of the children or the youth aging out of care are Indigenous. So the idea would be, we fund the community organizations, the money flows through those community organizations so that you build community and you build adult relationships that form the basis for autonomy, rather than, you know, putting too much emphasis on the money. And my worry is, so to us, they both go together. And I'm not suggesting that Sheila thinks any differently, but I think it's, to me, untangling the income and saying, then when we've got this, then we'll be able to go on to the other part. It's just not so clear to me that's a way to go.
Yeah, thank you. And I perhaps as we go along, and I just picked up on your term of autonomy, which is really important in the context of life improvement, linking to Sheila, making lives better, and the empowerment and the autonomy of making choices and the role that income plays in that. So we've heard perspectives or the context of this discussion in terms of national and provincial. So let's bring it to that point in terms of different players, jurisdictions, for initiating funding and delivering funding and monitoring funding. Any comments or thoughts as to what the relevant roles of our players in that space would be? Paul.
Yeah, maybe I could start, and let me start more parochially if I can, and pick up on the last exchange from David and Sheila. We need to be focused on the individual, the family, not just focused on the data and the strata. And one of the challenges, frankly, we have in government, and let me just say it from our own perspective, is that when somebody is struggling in poverty, we address them through one department. When somebody is struggling in terms of the workforce and in terms of being successful in the workforce, we address them through another department. When somebody is struggling with life issues, as Sheila's raising, we address them through an altogether different department. And while it may be a panis, Pollyannish to think, I don't think it's Pollyannish to say, how are we better organized? within our own government, and let me say it from our own perspective, to be able to really identify and address where people are and how they are getting along in different parts of their life, whether that's their age life, their economic life, their social life, whatever that may be, and to really think of it from that perspective, so that we don't have one department saying, okay, my job with this individual or this family is done, and then passing it over to another, but that we're really thinking of it as a continuum, because the reality, of course, is that people are moving in and out of different circumstances in their own lives, and we can't pass them on. But in terms of the collaboration across governments, you know, one question I have had, and I had with the panelists, is this issue of universality versus targeted, and what are we really trying to achieve through that? We've seen, again, great benefit right across the country from things like the child benefit and support for seniors. There's no question about that. It's made a huge difference in the lives of individuals and families right across the country, regardless of where they are, in their economic situations. So there is a value and a validity, I think, to having a national government that's taking a role and looking at this from that broad perspective, that broad universal perspective. But there's also, I think, some necessity of having some flexibility and understanding that situations in different jurisdictions, whether those are provincial or even smaller areas, are different. And so the kinds of supports, whether those are economic supports or other social and service level supports, really can be and should be differentiated based on those circumstances. So I don't think it can be universal without being uniform, I guess, is the point I'd make in that. And I realize that's a challenge, but I think it's a principle that we should be thinking about.
Okay, Sheila, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Paul says, for sure. I mean, not just at provincial and territorial, but at federal level too, we suffer from siloed departments. I know when I was working in the federal government, everybody was talking about horizontality, but you had to look hard to really find it. So I think there's a lot of work to do on that, but I think it's important to really look at where the strengths of different orders of government are. The feds really are and have the power to be really effective at gathering and distributing money. I mean, this is really, that's their forte. Provincial and territorial governments, and in Ontario, municipal governments have a role as well in delivering social services. And other municipalities across Canada, excuse me, also have, you know, responsibility for delivering services that affect people. Those are much more appropriately done, as with the examples that David gave. I mean, you do those in the community where you are, and you meet the needs where those people are. That's the strength of those closer orders of government. But for delivering a basic income, you know, to the extent that you can do that as simply as possible for as many people as possible through tax administration, as we've done with seniors and kids benefits. As I said, it's not going to solve everything, but I think it allows everybody to organize their lives better. And then provincial and territorial and municipal and civil society can organize what they do more effectively as well.
Okay, so lots of themes of complementarity, if that's a term, but also recognizing, and I use this term often, of future-proofing, of recognizing that, in particular in the context of COVID, as we've seen the acceleration of change and the acceleration of change due to circumstances and circumstance change is evolving very, very quickly. And in this context, how that scenario planning, how will the system in the most optimum way of complementarity and intersectionality keep up with that velocity of change? David, any thoughts on this in terms of roles of different players?
No, I don't have much to add. I think that's exactly right. I think the main issue is we even ran into it just getting the data that we got, the interactions between the federal and the provincial governments.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as probably everybody in this audience knows, is not easy. So the problem is, if you're going to be worried about how those things come together, you know, that's the biggest silo of it all, it seems like. Could I ask one quick question to Paul? Is that possible?
Of course.
Okay. I was just interested in your whole discussion, which I, you know, resonated strongly about, you know, worrying about the individuals and the families in, you know, sort of in the circumstances they live in. How does community play in with that? How do you, when you're making policy, how are you thinking about the sort of the communities that they're embedded in?
It plays a very big part, David. It's a great question. And we obviously are looking at things from demographic perspectives, but we do look at it more granularly than that. So we look at people who are living in rural areas and the kinds of supports that they need that are different than those who live in more urban areas. We look at the community actors and the kinds of civil society organizations, community groups that exist there and can be part of the program and service delivery and really want to be a part of it and are effective parts of it. So building capacity for them to be able to deliver services. So even in the seniors cohort, I mean, one of our objectives, for example, is to encourage more seniors to stay in their homes as long as is possible for them from safety and health and perspectives. So we've wrapped around services for them that include, you know, people going into their homes or community groups supporting them to go out and get groceries for them. So we get very much down to the granular level on those issues. And we've got all sorts of community organizations who are playing a role and wish to play an even greater role. And that's, you know, not something that's costed out, but is absolutely invaluable.
Yeah. Okay.
I jump into that one too, Ursula, really quickly, because I think it reinforces the point that Paul was making about flexibility and what David was talking about in terms of particular Indigenous populations, for example. So in Toronto, and this is all I speak for, so in Toronto, you have, even within the city, you're going to have very different ways of managing things. And I think of some of the neighborhoods that are classified as poorest economically and most challenged actually have phenomenal community organizing capacity. Like a little bit of money for those people, you just need to get out of the way and they know what to do. In other places, it might need more support. So that flexibility and tailoring, I think, is really critical.
Okay. I want to move us along. Again, I also speak to the issue of empowerment and autonomy, absolutely. So I'm going to jump along in the interest of time. We have about 15 minutes left and we've got lots of other topics, but I'm going to jump further along here, perhaps what could be considered a bit of a provocative question. So this is in the context of disincentivizing work. So is there, like, from your perspectives, do you feel there's a risk that basic income would create disincentives to work? If you want to expand on that one way or the other. So maybe I'll start with David first on this.
Okay. Reverse order. This is one area where we put a fair amount of effort into, including a pretty interesting study by Craig Riddell, who's at UBC, and his son Chris, who's at Waterloo, where they went back and re-looked at the MINCOME data from the Manitoba experiment in the 1970s. And one of the interesting things they found was actually that while the overall estimated effect on of MINCOME on labor supply essentially was very close to zero, and that comes up a lot. You get estimates that are very close to zero. In fact, when you look closer, it split into two groups. Well, three. Men at that time, basically no effect at all. Women who were in receipt of income assistance, for them, actually, it increased work. And those were mostly lone parent mothers. And that probably had a lot to do with the fact that the income assistance system there at that time had very high tax back rates. And then women with children at home, they had fairly big decreases in work, but it was ahead of its time. Income asked life satisfaction questions, and those women expressed increases in life satisfaction. Interestingly, the lone parent women who moved into work actually expressed decreases in life satisfaction in the surveys. And I think all of that kind of brings together some things that I know have been themes in Sheila's work, which is we want to be careful about separating work and work in some sense, right? It's like the mothers who were removing from paid work were almost certainly, doing lots of work of other kinds, right, with their kids, et cetera. And so my kind of take on a lot of this is, will this have an impact on, especially if we move to a substantial basic income, would it have an impact on the extent of paid work? Yes, at levels that are not huge, but would be there. But then once you take into account the other kinds of work that come into place, my sort of rough feeling is this is not a determining factor. Like somebody is arguing against a basic income based on this notion that everyone's going to sit at home on their couch. I just don't think that's not an argument that I would make for sure.
Yeah. Sheila, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with David. And I bring a very much a non-economist perspective to this as well. You can't tell from looking at me, but I am the white minority in my family. My children are Black. And so I have done a lot of study of racial history and that sort of thing, and looking at pattern in the United States in particular. When slaves were freed, they became lazy. When every successive wave of immigration came into the United States, the Italians, the Irish, everybody became somehow lazy or morally deficient or something. These are like cultural, psychological things that people worry about other people not being like them. And, as David said, like there's evidence, and then there's these deep psychological things, and they're very different issues.
Anything to add on that one, Paul, in the context of?
There certainly is some discussion about that, and that's been a point that's been raised through debate here, both internally and in our legislative assembly, and then just publicly. But I would tend to agree that this is not a major factor. I should say that one of the things that we have done with people currently under social assistance is we've made some major reforms to allow them to or to not, I should say, I should put this in the negative towards government, to not be clawing back on income that they earn while they are drawing social assistance. And really what we're conscious of is we want to encourage people to get associated, get connected, get successful in the workforce. But to have the benefit and the support that is needed, both through income, but also through training and other social supports, so that they can reach that point and be successful. We also, of course, want to see incomes for those who are working increase, and that's a real objective. That's not just achieved through things like minimum wages, but also is achieved through working with employer groups and ensuring that people are receiving a fair wage. And one of the points that has been made through the Premier's group on economic recovery and growth through COVID, which is a very broad-based across sectors, economic, social, community, is the real importance of a fair working wage, and that's something that is also important. So again, this is not just about working on basic income and exclusively on that. It's looking at how everyone, wherever they are, can be successful and supported as they get on with their lives.
Okay, thank you. We do have a potential question around the influence of basic income on wages, but I do. We've got about 10 minutes left. So if we look at the BC expert panel's recommended approach of strengthening social programming, if that was followed, how would the impact on poverty compared with that from a basic income of the kind recommended by PI's legislative committee play out? Any thoughts there?
I mean, I guess I could start since it's our report. That's something that partly because our recommendations were sort of so wide ranging, so they included a whole bunch of things that were about labor regulation with exactly the ideas that Paul had in mind, that these things are actually very integrated. You know, some portion of the people who are using income assistance now, you know, a notion that you're going to give training and then that's going to lead to some kind of middle-class life is not true. You sort of want to meet these people where they are, and a lot of them express a desire to work, but their work options are short and crappy, honestly. And so then you want to make sure that, exactly as Paul said, you want to make sure they get the support when that's not there, and that you sort of support them in that kind of work when it's there. So what we did in terms of looking at poverty was actually sort of divide into the different groups. And this is something I think Sheila's already brought up, which is, and something that I don't know whether everybody knows full well, but the highest rates of poverty right now are amongst adults without children, single adults without children. And they're very high in places. In BC, we're looking at like 32% rates of poverty in that group. And so essentially what we did on the poverty side in a large part was ask, okay, so what set of policies are going to be most useful here? And within that group, we then looked into the data to see who was about 20% of those people actually work more than 40 weeks a year. And a lot of those are the people that we've seen come to the fore in COVID, right? They're actually tend to be predominantly female. They're predominantly in service sector areas. And so now you're looking at questions about how do we make that work better? How do we make work pay? How do we make regulation actually hold there? Because it mostly doesn't, to tell you the truth. Then we have this other group of sort of older males. And for them, again, this is back to this notion of like, well, what you want to acknowledge there is this is a group who wants to work. You want to support them in work, but the work is never going to be great. And it's probably not going to like just move them away from whatever other supports there could be. And so there we're looking at issues that are more about income assistance reform. For the first group, it's more like work regulations and earning subsidies. But sorry, I've never answered your first question because I don't have a short answer to it. You know,
no, these are, you know,
instead of that, I don't know the answer to that.
These are not simple questions that can necessarily have a very quick, simple answer, but just fascinating discussion, really, really, really informative. Sheila, any thoughts on this particular question?
No, I forget what the question was too, but I'd like to talk about single people as well. So one of the benefits that we see of basic income, I mean, we tend to talk a lot about people who are on social assistance, but we've got this huge cohort of people who really don't get much access to any kind of support at all while they are working. And you know, what we found in the Ontario pilot, for example, is you've got people who are surviving on 2, 3, 4 jobs. And what the basic income allowed them to do was like cut down to 2 jobs. And that then allowed them to do better in that job and to succeed. The problem with single people in particular is that you don't have a lot of fallback room. You know, one of the de facto social safety nets in Canada now is the 2-income couple. So if you're on your own and lose your job and something else in your life goes a bit haywire, you don't have much capacity for resilience. And a basic income in that situation does act as a preventative from people falling, you know, down to the point where they have to apply for social assistance. You have to lose everything, you know, in order to apply, kind of thing. So it adds a layer of resilience to a lot of those people who are really struggling while they're working.
Paul?
So the PI report from the legislative committee said that the target should be to get everyone to 85% of market basket measure. And the cohorts, just to pick up exactly what David and Sheila said, who don't reach that right now, the reality is that for a large proportion of our population were there already through the various levels of support, federal and provincial. But for the largest proportion of population that's not there are singles, whether those are singles younger or single seniors. And that's the group that we really need to address. And in our case, it's not just, or it is particularly single males and single young males that we're really challenged with, or challenged with reaching income levels that are truly secure. So that's a particular challenge that we have that we're focused on. But when we take the report from the committee and measure it against where our population is, we've largely hit it, at least based on the 2018 figures. Now, the other reality of that is that those figures keep changing, and some of the circumstances and the context and around things like housing do change even more rapidly. We try to control those, of course, but the reality is that they do change. So we can't kind of say, okay, we're doing well for that population and pat ourselves on the back. Not at all. I think that we just need to keep working on these issues. But it is that particular cohort, in our case, young males, single, that is particularly challenged.
Okay, so that actually is a really good segue to probably will be my last question at this point, and then we're going to turn it over to Raphael, because we've got lots of questions coming from our audience today, which is fantastic, and then I'll come back to everyone for a final comment. So, and maybe a little biased being from a research granting agency, but a research agency or supporting research. So should a basic income pilot come to bear to be run in Canada, or if more research is to be produced, are there key research questions that would be useful to address to help inform? As you say, that the data is changing and the circumstances are changing. So what, any thoughts on those kinds of research questions or other potential benefits that research could help address earlier on to inform your thinking?
Does anyone? I mean, I'll go first, but I don't.
As a scholar, professor, maybe that's good. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. I can tell you what our conclusion was, and I'll be interested to hear what both Sheila and Paul think. Our feeling was there's not a good reason. It was hard for us to come up with a good argument to run a pilot. And I can tell you the rationale for that. One is, and this comes back to what Sheila was saying before, there is a fair bit of evidence out there. Now, we can talk about exactly how we see that evidence, but there's a fair bit. The question is, what do we not know about a basic income? And therefore, why would we run a pilot? And I think the thing we don't know, and the thing that is the most essential claim for a basic income, is if you give this income to people on a permanent basis, do they change their lives in big ways? Like, do they start a firm? Do they go back to school? Do they do, a whole set of things? To the best of my knowledge, no pilot has ever run more than 5 years. Most of them have been interrupted at some point or politically messed with. So the idea that we are getting out of a pilot the information on that question, I think for the most part is not true. That's my feeling. In terms of how one would progress, by the way, the other thing is think about the timing of a pilot. If we wanted to get it long-term enough to actually get the information, we're talking a year and a half, 2 years to probably get it in place, run it for 5-6 years, analyze it for another few years. You're talking about delaying action for like 10 years. So I would say instead, our suggestion is you proceed with reform, but you do it incrementally, and you do it in a way where you are purposely setting it out in sort of ways that are systematic so that you can use that to measure the impacts. The other thing about a systematic approach is that you involve the communities who are involved so that the expertise is not just data expertise or the kinds of things that we bring to the table, but it's the community who are affected who are saying, this is how it's affecting us. This is what we're seeing. We don't like this. And you have to change on the fly. Now that is a messier way to do government for sure. It's probably something that, lots of people who work in government and know how hard it is to make things, implement things are sort of, maybe a little worried about. But anyway, that was our approach. In the end, it was like not a pilot, an incremental approach that involves community. That was
right. Yeah. Yeah, Sheila, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely agree with David. No pilots. There's nothing that we're going to learn that's going to make any difference. And even 10 years, so one of the things that a basic income is supposed to address, according to lots of people, is the impact of technological disruption. In 10 years, the world is going to look entirely different. So whatever results you thought you got even long term, it's going to make no difference by then. So like, I just don't think you're going to learn anything valuable through a pilot. On the incremental, I don't know, it sort of depends. You have to be really clear about where you're going, and you have to look at particular milestones. I just saw something briefly in the chat that popped up. If you, for example, if you don't start out at a high enough level, then you're not going to see enough impact to demonstrate results that would make you go forward. The other bit of history lesson, however, though, is what happened with child benefits. So the people who were arguing for it back in the 1990s knew clearly what the goal was, and it was built on, you know, some really realistic assumptions. It didn't start out that big, but as it jumped up in increments, you could really see what a difference it made. And as it has been enhanced and changed over time, and so this is where you monitor how things are going on. You don't just let it run, so that you can improve and adjust over time. Another experience with Norwegian parental benefits, where they wanted fathers to take up parental benefits. They didn't meet their target the first time. They adjusted the policy several times until they got the dads in there. So we can do that too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Paul, some very strong views about running a pilot there. Your thoughts on that one?
Well, we're running pilots. So call them pilots, call them demonstration. We're taking 2 population cohorts, and one of those are people with disabilities, and running what we call an assured income pilot with them, which really is more than a pilot. It's a commitment to raise their income supports, to raise them a significant level, and also to increase and enhance the other service and program supports that are being provided. And then we're also developing what we have called a secure income pilot that is going to take a cohort of people who are under social assistance, who are traditionally challenged with getting into the workforce, and doing something similar with them. So I don't know that they're pilots as much as they are developments in what we're doing, and a commitment to continue that. The 2 areas I think that are really important. One is, and we've touched on this a little bit, is some of the interoperability of income supports, employment supports, other supports, and how they all should work and fit together. And how do we ensure that we are not either over or under advantaging anyone in that spectrum of no work, little work, and low income work, and really looking at that area. And that's an issue that we're trying to get our heads around. And the other is just around the qualitative impact of this. There's a lot of data that is generated, and we've all tried to absorb your report, David. There's lots of insight in that, and lots of data. But what should we really be thinking of in terms of qualitative impacts? And what are the measures of that really should be seen, whether that's from a policy perspective or from a community perspective? And how should we be really testing our achievements on that front?
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I just want to keep going, but I promised I would share this wonderful task of moderating with Raphael. And as we all saw, yeah, great comments, actually a lot on issues around housing as well. So with that, I will just step back for a little bit, and Raphael will take over, and then I'll be back. Thank you so much. Merci.
Thanks to the panelists again. Yes, and I'm not sharing this role of moderating. You did a terrific job, so thank you. I'm literally just reading off the questions that we've gotten through the chat. We've had a pretty active conversation so far. But I think there was a really interesting question that I got directly in my mailbox, well, in my chat personal box is, what do you think the unintended impacts of the introduction of basic income in one province or territory would be? And would these impacts be possible deterrents to introducing a basic income in one province or a territory, or as opposed to nationally?
If I could start, Raphael, I think the only concern that that I've heard expressed is that it might really attract people to one part of the country, and maybe that's a good thing. Frankly, I don't see it as necessarily a negative, but that's one of the issues that has been raised, that people would see a value of moving into a jurisdiction because it has that level of guaranteed income support.
Can I just to follow up on that? I think part of the framing of the question is partly also about sort of political fallout. It's like, you know, if there were some issues, and I actually think the one Paul raised is probably an important one for political reasons within provinces, is my guess. I mean, I can tell you that in the data that we looked at quite a big cut in income assistance that happened in British Columbia in 2002. And we can see in the administrative data a set of people who left the province, who were involved in various parts of the support system network. Now, the interesting thing about them is a lot of them also, we could see that they showed up in the province within the previous 3 years or so. So we think a bunch of this is actually, we don't have Alberta data, but we think a bunch of this is probably along the BC-Alberta border, and there's some amount of movement. The sort of standard result in the literature is you don't see a lot of movement in response to this because people have, as we've talked a lot about here, social networks, families. Like, you don't move from PEI to BC to chase down an extra $100 a month because it's, you know, you're left supportless when you do that. So I actually think that in terms of, would it really be a big issue for governments? Probably not. On the other hand, we've seen many governments over the years, you know, back to Ralph Klein giving bus tickets to people to go to BC. You know, I think politically it could be an important issue.
It's interesting because I see quite the opposite of that phenomenon more likely to happen. That if there really is interest in the federal government working with PEI to get something going there, I've talked to people in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they'd be really interested too. And with COVID, with all of the impacts that economies have suffered, with all of the strain on provincial budgets, and, you know, dealing with the fallout of COVID is just immense. I would think the provinces would be very interested in helping get a national program together so that everybody is in a better situation.
Thanks. I think that covers that question. I guess it depends on how flexible and mobile you are, if you want to change provinces or not. But it's definitely an interesting question. Moving on, we've had a couple questions relating to skills and employment and training and the impacts that it has towards this. But would basic income help the working poor? So there's a characterization on the working poor and how working poor folks are supported in the current system, as opposed to how basic income would come play in and support that.
If I could start on that, I would recommend people look at the study that was done by Wayne Luchuk and Mohammed Ferdowsi, Paul McDowell, people at McMaster University, on participants in the Ontario pilot. It shows that people who actually had jobs upon entering the pilot actually did much better. And then other people, it was amazing in the intake survey how the high percentage of people who thought they had dead-end jobs, which explains why a large percentage of people also opted to go back to school when they were on the pilot.
I mean, I'll take a turn. Sort of evidence that we had quite a nice study done by Arthur Sweetman at McMaster on exactly this issue. I think there's an interesting question here, and actually I'd be interested to hear what the other two think. I think there's an interesting question here about how we think about supporting transitions. Okay, so part of the issue here is, do people leave dead-end jobs? Do they get training? Youth in their parts of transition, and is the basic income the right platform for that? And I have a thought, but I'm just sort of interested in other people's opinion, which is, there's a sense in which I think the basic income is not the right tool for transition, strangely enough, even though it's the one that's often put forward. And the reason is, imagine that we have a basic income and it's permanent. Okay, so not like the Ontario situation where suddenly people are given this money and now it's moment to make a change. But we really actually have one where it's been in place for a while. And you're a person who's in a low income job, so therefore you're getting a fair bit of the, you're getting a fair bit of the basic income itself, because assuming we're talking about a negative income tax version of it, right? Now you want to change jobs. That at that point you have built that basic income into your car payments, into your rents. It's a part of who you are and how you live. The transitions, you require something over and above that to do that. So I think this is a separate argument from some of Sheila's other points about, security and do you feel security? That I think is an important question. This is about, is it the springboard for transitions? And it's less clear to me than it is that if you wanted to put a basic income in that did the other parts, the security parts, you would still need other programs that actually stepped in at the moment when you leave your job and actually, go free falling and say, okay, now I'm ready to make a big jump. And given that you've already built the basic income into your car payments, et cetera, it's not so clear to me it's gonna help with those completely. But anyway, it's a thought.
Just to add a little bit to that, the other element I think that's important is the benefits or lack thereof that are provided to people who are in lower income or gig style jobs. And I know that's been a matter that we've tackled, and we actually pitched a few years ago the idea of a general benefits package that would trail workers as they transition from job to job to job, especially in younger years when finding that employment path was challenging. And we hear that in our circumstance, that people are not just worried about losing their income, but about losing the benefits that they may have associated with the job. And that if you have a young family, or if you have some health considerations, is a major factor.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it gives you a little bit of a liberty to choose your career path and what you want to do. So it's very interesting. Thank you. Another question I think was for you specifically, Paul, but feel free to answer all of you. Is PEI using personas to determine the possible impacts or the possible impact of the provincial response on various demographics, youth in foster care, single mothers, immigrants, refugees, or is PEI aiming to determine possible, or how is PEI aiming to determine possible impacts?
Right, so we're not really going at it at the individual personalized level, but we certainly are thinking of it in terms of some of those categories. And I mentioned earlier about the pilots or the demonstration developments that we're doing now. And then within those, we are certainly very conscious of looking at new Canadians, looking at Indigenous populations, looking at people within those particular age and educational attainment cohorts. So yes, we are doing some of that, but not at the persona level, I would say, not really getting down to that granularity. And one of the challenges here, of course, is that while we're small, we can be even too intimate, and that it's hard to disaggregate some of the information that we have, and we don't want this to be overly personalized, if I can say that.
David, Sheila, did you want to take a crack at it as well? Did you have a comment?
No. No, that was interesting. That's
all right. Next up, I think earlier on, I think we touched upon it a little bit, but maybe we can get back to it. It was about basic income and the influence on wages for low paid and low skilled jobs. It kind of goes back a little bit on the skills and employment, but I don't know if we wanted to add to that, or maybe we can start with Sheila.
So this is one of those things where it really does depend on individual situations very often. You know, what a person's skills are, what the employer is like. And to me, the value of a basic income is that it gives you options. So one of those options is the ability to say no to an abusive employer or somebody who just isn't going to pay you what you think it's worth. And then gradually that might encourage some of those employers to improve, you know, both pay and working conditions, that sort of thing. On the other hand, it also allows people to say yes to things that they think are really good and valuable jobs and things that they like to do, even though they perhaps don't pay as well. So to me, it's having flexibility and options for people to find their way through the paid labor force.
I can jump in. I think there's an interesting the 2 points that Sheila put on the table, I think, are interesting and different to me. So the one about taking particular jobs, I think that's completely possible. Again, it's not clear to me we have enough long-term evidence to know the answer to that, but I think that's completely possible. The other one, I think, comes back to the interesting question of sort of exit versus voice, right? So if and this is a discussion that happens in the labor relations literature, which is essentially like, how do you influence what happens in your workplace? So one is you essentially threaten to leave or you leave, and the basic income is essentially in that mode. The other is what you would call voice, which is you stay, but you organize and you do things through the workforce that way. Both of them can have an impact. I guess my feeling is not that a basic income might not have this effect. I mean, I actually can point to literature that suggests that there are these kinds of bargaining effects, but that the more direct way is actually to worry about labor regulation, minimum wages, supporting organization, and that if on this particular file, I'm not saying basic income would be bad for this at all, but I'm just saying, you know, if this is our concern, let's go at it directly. That's kind of my feeling on this one.
Paul, did you have a closing comment?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to all of that is that we should be very much attuned to where the pressures or opportunities are in the workforce, both now and in the immediate future. It's hard to see the long-term future, but we can certainly see trends. And I think that I know in our jurisdiction, it seems to me right across Canada that we're faced with that kind of dichotomy, that we've got so many people who are looking for work and so many jobs that are looking for people. And how do we bridge that gap? And that's something that we constantly have to work on, and not just so that the labor force or that the economy ticks along, but that people are truly successful, and that they're, to Sheila's point, being able to choose a path that allows them to really thrive themselves, and in doing so allows that organization, company, community to thrive at the same time.
Yeah, I would just agree with everybody. It's not either or. We need all of these things, and they can work together. Thanks,
Sheila and Paul and David. And you just answered one of the questions that just popped up in the chat at the same time. So we can move on to the next one. It's a general question. We heard from the federal provincial perspectives. So what about the federal leadership and for national standards? So they're specifically mentioning around the national standards for social services, much in the same way the post-war social security programs, right? That I guess the sentence was, what about federal leadership for national standards for social services in much of the same way the post-war social security programs, I guess, were established?
I mean, I can say that because a lot of what we're focusing on is some along the lines basic services in places. I mean, one of the things we recommended, for example, which goes back to some of the things we were talking about before, was health supplements of all kinds, starting with dental, making that universal and not, right now in BC, I imagine in most provinces, it's conditioned on being on income assistance or just having moved off of income assistance, making it universal. Having the feds actually lead that to some degree and provide money for it would be great. Whether that's provincially doable, we can name at least 1 or 2 provinces that might not go along. We could put Paul on the spot and ask him what he thinks about the feds putting down a bunch of rules. But anyway.
Yeah, again, I would say, I mean, this is the way that most of our, I mean, really big iconic programs have been developed. And I would, like National Healthcare Program is based on a set of standards. We don't have that same kind of thing for income security now, and I think it's really needed.
Just go back to one of the points I made earlier, and that is that universality doesn't have to mean uniformity necessarily, and I think that we can often treat the two as being the same. More specifically, I would say that in certain areas, it would be important to look at jurisdictions that are getting it right and build from those strengths rather than trying to layer something over it that could in fact have the impact of bringing some leading jurisdictions down. And I don't think anyone wants to see that. So appreciate that that's a very, very challenging undertaking. To wit all the discussions that we have through this country every year, every decade on the delivery of healthcare. It's quite a challenge, but I think that we need to look at where we've got some winning solutions already and try to build on those.
Okay, thanks. And I think we have time for one last question. And this one has been kind of alluded to a little bit, even on our poster when we were talking about the CERB and how it's kind of brought forth the idea of maybe basic income is affordable. Maybe we can start talking about this. Maybe it's manageable, but I think there's another question that also expands on the unconditional aspect or universal UBI and versus a negative income tax, right? So what are the key differences there between a negative income tax and a completely unconditional UBI? And if UBI is implemented through the tax system, would it be viable and affordable?
Okay.
That's
a complex question.
20 seconds? Is that what...
we have 2 minutes if someone wants to address it.
Hours do we
have
have
a little bit more.
Yeah, so I would recommend everybody read BICN's policy options document to kind of see what we've done. As David said, if you go for a fully universal demo grant where every individual gets the same amount of money at a level that's sufficient to get everybody out of poverty and that sort of thing, basically the tax rate on your first dollar of other income is just going to be enormous. And it's doable and you can get the same outcomes, but it requires just phenomenal change to the tax system and the way we understand things. Then I don't like negative income tax. It sounds negative and awful. It's like 2 words in there that people don't like, negative and tax. But if you look, so this is what we term the guarantee model. So it's universal in that it's there for everybody like an insurance policy. So not even if you need it, but when you need it. In my own life, I've been a beneficiary of social programs that I have then contributed to most of the rest of my life. So when you need it, when your income drops to a certain level, it's there for you. But we're not giving checks to billionaires, which is what some people immediately jump to when they hear the words basic income. So there are different models, different ways of doing it. Within our 3 options, there are all sorts of options for, how you structure it, how you fund it, where you go for funding sources. So it's it's political decisions, but it certainly is affordable. And I think I saw it somewhere in another question. I think the important thing is to look at it as an investment. So you're building something that's going to get a return, and it's going to save you money in all sorts of other ways in other places, like the healthcare system, we would presume. So that, I think that's the important element to this, is that we're investing in people who are then going to contribute to our society in a more effective way.
Could I, because I think Sheila did a good job about the NIT and Demogrant person or whatever. Can I go to the other question, the CERB one, which is?
Oh yeah, I forgot.
What's that?
I forgot that.
All right. My opinion is, I don't believe we've learned almost anything from the CERB about a permanent basic income. I think the right way to look at the CERB is, we came along with a massive event and we managed to insure ourselves against that massive event. And I think it was a good job. It had, by the way, it's not unconditional, right? It's conditional on, earning last year. It's conditional on losing your job to COVID. It's not financed, as Sheila's, like I said, excellent report on basic income in the tax system is, what you see in there is like how you finance it affects how you think about this, how this goes. So there's sort of like, we'll worry about how finance it later. So we learn nothing about that. The trust and verify approach, I think we're about to find out, is going to be a big, painful experience for Canada. And the idea that that would exist permanently, I'm guessing not a great idea. So my feeling is we haven't learned much about whether a basic income is a good idea or not from one way or the other, by the way, for the long haul. I think what we've learned is what we should do is take down a lot of notes on what just happened. Essentially form a system and put it in the vault so that the next time this comes and we decide on the trigger that brings it in, and we put it in place when we need to. And acknowledge that what the CERB was a massive insurance scheme against a massive negative shock, negative in the right sense that time. But so, and then we have to have a talk about what we do the rest of the time, and whether a basic income and a permanent level is the right thing for the rest of the time, I think is a different discussion to me, at least.
Let me just say quickly, and I'm not going to disagree with what David has just said. In fact, I agree that comparing basic income to the CERB is a little bit, apples to grapefruits maybe. Sheila's shaking her head, but I do want to mention one thing. Yeah. Our special legislative committee on poverty did do a costing of what basic income would cost in our province, and came up with a figure of about $320 million that would have about 50,000 people eligible to receive. CERB had about 36,000 people in PEI drawing from it at a cost of about $265 million. So in terms of the dollars, at least, not far off. And but I don't disagree with David that we need to be thinking about, those are different populations. Some overlap, but different populations. But just to say that when these things occur, where there's a will and pressure, there's a way to do it. And I guess that's the question: is there a way to tackle something like this, not just in a single jurisdiction, but right across the country?
Yeah, I agree with David too. The one thing I would add that I think is an important lesson, and I can't claim to have come up with this myself, I read it somewhere, the idea that cash is the currency of crisis. And if you bring this down to a very human level in a very ordinary life, I mean, COVID was a crisis for all of us, but in our own lives at different points, we reach crisis. And I remember a low-income participant at a conference that was held a while ago who talked about the story of his life. He had made some bad decisions. He was trying to straighten things out. But he said he estimated that $400 was the difference between being on the edge of crisis all the time. So his car breaks down, he can't make it to a job interview, he loses the job, it goes downhill. So the cash lesson, I think, is important. But the rest of it, I agree with them entirely. Like we're dealing with apples and grapefruits.
All right, I think we're going to need to close. So I'll give it back to Ursula.
Actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to also pass the baton to our chair, Taryn Wasson, for closing remarks. But I do absolutely want to extend our deepest gratitude to you all for a fabulous discussion. And as Raphael mentioned, it has been recorded and will be shared by IPAC-NCR to all of our members and to the public. So thank you again, and grand merci, and to all the participants for their wonderful comments and questions.
Thank you, Ursula and Raphael, as well as to our guest speakers today. If you haven't already, everyone that's still here, I would encourage you to give a thumbs up, or there's no thumbs up and thumbs down in Zoom, so hopefully it's only up. There's a clap emoji as well, and so whatever emoji you feel reflects your expression at today's event. Hopefully you did enjoy the event, and grand merci à tout le monde. I just want to quickly let you know that you can stay tuned for our upcoming IPAC events. The next event is taking place next month on April 15th. We're looking at the future of Canada, Canada 2030. This event is in collaboration with Deloitte. And we already have some phenomenal speakers lined up as well. Senator Tony Dean, who's an independent senator, a former clerk of the Ontario Public Service. He's one of the speakers, as well as a couple of others. Stay tuned for more info. And then really in the summer, we're actually going to be organizing a big conference, the 73rd Annual IPAC National Conference. If you haven't come to an IPAC conference before, I would highly encourage you to consider it this summer. And really all of the events that we've done throughout the year, we've actually changed up our events so that we can actually support our main constituency of public servants. And we've done that to support them, not just in the NCR, but beyond. And help them in different ways. So we've covered topics like mental health. We added some humor with an event on Yes Minister, and we've covered topical public policy issues like the social welfare reform. So thank you again, merci encore, and hopefully you join us in the future. We look forward to welcoming you again. So thanks, merci, bye.
Thank you, stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.